So I want to move to the vision part that you alluded to earlier. And I read your article, and it stated about nationalization and public putting institutions such as the military industrial complex, media into the public hand, even the financial sectors. And you even mentioned publicly run Walmart and Amazon's. Talk about this a little bit, and also what do you make of the argument that putting things into the public hand, all of these sectors, could lead to massive centralization, eliminate competition, and create a massive bureaucracy, monopoly. And it would just change the face of ownership, but you still have the real practice of monopolization.
Well, the second question is a very relevant concern, but let me deal with the first one first. I think one of the things that's missing from the discourse in the American left and Canadian left for that matter, and I can't speak to Europe because I just don't know it well enough, or other countries where what I'm suggesting may be going on. There's not a vision to fight for. There's some policy issues to fight for. You know, Medicare for all, break up the big banks, although I don't think that's going to be very effective, even if you could. But still, minimum wage. But that's not a vision of a new society. And there's lots of countries in Europe and Canada that have more or less have those things: minimum wage, healthcare, and so on. The vision of a society that actually isn't run by the financial oligarchy, that needs to be talked about. And I don't know whether Bernie should or shouldn't have, because I don't know how do you, I've never had to win an election in mainstream US politics, so I can't say. But I think a popular movement needs to talk about it. And maybe if we work more on this vision of what society could be, we'll also get the left out of so many silos. And instead of making demands, like here's the other part, it's kind of connected to the earlier argument. Let's say enough of the left don't vote for Biden and Trump wins. And then you're going to organize the movement, right? Well, the most you'll ever be able to do is make demands on a Trump administration, which he'll completely ignore. Not to say Biden might not, or probably would, but it's not about taking power. You can say it's about taking power, but it isn't really. Because the electoral politics in the United States in any short-term way is not allow a third party. So what you can do is, at very best, have some protests in the street and demand this and demand that, but you're asking the oligarchy to do something. You're not taking power away from them. So I think we need to have a more unifying vision of the kind of society we're fighting for, and not, so utopian that it's so far off you can't even imagine it. But something that if you had a president, House, Senate, and same thing in other countries, if you had actual control of the government, what would you do with it? If you had to govern on behalf of the majority of the people in a real world where you're going to be surrounded by enemies, very, very powerful enemies, what would you do if you had to govern a city? We're seeing a bit of that we saw that there's a progressive government in Barcelona in Spain, and you probably know more about that than I do. There's been some breakthroughs, but once you get elected, we saw this with Chavez. Chavez got elected in Venezuela, and honestly, I know the Venezuelan situation pretty well because my partner worked directly with Chavez for quite a few years, and they didn't know what to do with it once they got elected. There wasn't really, there was a kind of a very general vision, but in terms of a real strategy of, when do you nationalize this, and what section of the elites do you take on here? And I think, personally, Chavez took on everybody at the same time, and it didn't work. So let's start really trying to imagine. So, for example, the most outlandish of my vision, but I think it's worth talking about, is there's been this tremendous concentration of ownership in 3 companies: BlackRock, State Street and Vanguard. The two biggest ones are BlackRock and Vanguard. And these are what they call asset management companies. And they invest the money that's invested in them from pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, billionaires. Tons of people wind up having their money there because they do these pension funds from unions. The mutual funds wind up putting money in them. Between those three companies, they control 90% of the S&P 500. That's essentially they essentially control every major company in the United States and to a large extent around the world. Go look at in Europe how much BlackRock owns. When there's barely a company, unless it's like the Amazon that has a single billionaire that owns it, or there's a couple of others like that. But almost every company, the institutional investors are the majority owners, and the biggest owners of those are BlackRock and Vanguard. Military-industrial complex, Vanguard and BlackRock. The 18 companies that make nuclear weapons, BlackRock and Vanguard. The New York Times, 95% owned by the same institutional investors. All the media that own the news, with the exception of Bloomberg, because it's another one of these privately owned things, all the media owned by controlled essentially by the same handful of institutional investors who get to control who manages, because they control the board meetings. So I can go more on about that, but just imagine a progressive government buys control of BlackRock. You don't nationalize it, you buy it. I mean, they can invent trillions of dollars just like that. So let's invent enough money, buy the controlling interest at BlackRock. You just wound up controlling 90% of the corporations in the United States. Okay. Will they fight like hell? Yeah. So it all depends. Is the popular movement strong enough to defend such a policy? Okay, don't even go that far. Next time there's a big crash, and they're going to be over and over, take one of the banks that wants bailouts and don't bail them out. Nationalize them. They should have nationalized Lehman Brothers. They could have nationalized Bank of America. And it's interesting, even some sections of Wall Street supported it. Now, they wanted it done only for a certain amount of time and then brought back to the private sector again. But why? Imagine a publicly owned Amazon. You raise everyone's minimum wage to $25, invest profit. A section of the profit goes back into the treasury so you can lower the taxes on workers. You can imagine so many things. But the problem you raise is for real. Concentration of ownership of the economy leads to concentration of ownership in the politics. It's what we see now. And it would be the danger if you had such centralized public ownership as you saw, for example, in the Soviet Union. Yes, that would lead to bureaucratization. It would lead to a concentration of political power into whoever controlled the state. But we don't live in the era of the Soviet Union anymore. When the Soviet Union was trying to plan their economy, they did it with a pencil and paper, maybe a typewriter. There were no computers. The bureaucratization was absolutely inevitable. And it was not a multi-party system. So you have a single party system and such centralized ownership. We don't live in that era. We live in an era where you could have regional ownership of this public Amazon. You could have property could be owned at the level of cities, groups of states, co-ops, nonprofits. A lot of the biggest health insurance plans in fact, most of the health insurance plans in the United States and in Canada used to be nonprofit. Even now in Canada, you have publicly owned auto insurance in British Columbia, the booze in Ontario, the liquor's controlled by a publicly owned company. In many places, Europe and here, energy companies are publicly owned. But the most critical part of this is you cannot, especially in the United States, have that kind of public ownership model without genuine and serious democratization. So you got to start with campaign finance reform, and more so, like far more drastic than just undoing Citizens United, There has to be straightforward public financing. You have to just get all this kind of money out of politics. And one of the fastest way to do that would be to ban advertising. I'd like to see just completely ban not just television advertising, social media advertising. Everything paid should be not allowed during an election. Now, I know these things, people will say, oh, you'll never get that. Let's articulate a vision of stuff we can fight for, and then figure out the tactics and strategy of building a movement. And of course, it's not like you're going to get elected and do all these things. But without a vision, a really forward-looking vision, I don't think people get inspired. I had a really interesting conversation with an African-American woman last time I was in New York. And she lived in Michigan, and she supported Biden over Sanders. And as we were talking, it didn't matter what I say in terms of Sanders, she would have a talking point from the Democratic Party to respond to me. So, for example, I would say healthcare for all, and she would say Bernie's too old. And I would say minimum wage or whatever, and she would say, oh, Bernie's divisive, and on and on and on. And it didn't matter how much back and forth. And then I started talking to her not about what Bernie was saying. I started talking about how about imagining a society where you have public ownership of the critical parts of the economy and a real democratization. All of a sudden, we were actually agreeing on stuff. So it's not just that if we talk better, we'll get more people. It's a combination of many factors. But in terms of this issue of public ownership, it's very critical. And it's really interesting to me. And this is where you can actually persuade some people that see, pre-Cold War in the United States, public ownership was not a bad word. If you go back and look at the speeches of Roosevelt in the 30s, not only did he say that electricity, which had become a terrible monopoly and extorting people, should be regulated as a public utility with serious regulation. He said any sector of the economy that gets monopolized is a critical sector in terms of people's needs, could be made publicly owned. It was like a part of his discourse. And most of the young American population is past the Cold War now. You know, we talked earlier about the word socialism. I mean, a lot of Americans don't, it's not the boogeyman anymore. So I think we need to combine a vision for what a future could look like with very serious demands about the unemployed and the poor and systemic racism. We need to raise always the issue of climate, and we need to start raising the issue of nuclear war, because it's not even nobody even talks about it except for a handful of people.